Here, let's see if you can hear me now. Yes, thank you. And I want to thank all of you for coming to our book series, and especially to Alma Gildenhorn, who is the founder of it and the greatest supporter of it, and many other aspects of the Aspen Institute. Thank you so much, Alma, and to your husband, Joe, for all that you do. And we're so fortunate to be in this great new space, to be able to come together as a community to hear from one of the greatest journalists in the country and one of the greatest policy thinkers about the scope and role of government in the country. And we're joined by 20 of the greatest students in the country from Columbia Heights Educational Campus. They are AP English juniors and reading The Kite Runner right now, I heard. And so now they're going to come hear from two great thinkers. And I hope, get your hands up and ask some questions, okay? So thank you all. The two of you, thank you so much for being here. Have a great afternoon. Thank you, Alma.
Thank you, Dan. And what a great bit of news for the Aspen Institute to have this remarkably talented man as its new leader, which is going to take it to new heights from an already very high position. It's no surprise that we have a large crowd here. Ken Auletta has written amazing books and amazing profiles and amazing articles over a long career. This book is going to make you think about a whole lot of things, of changes that have occurred in our world and changes yet to come, many of which are unsettling. And so I want to start, Ken, by asking you, as I started to read this book, I wondered where it was going, because the focus was a guy that I, frankly, not being part of the ad world, knew nothing about, Michael Kasson. He's obscure, I think, to people who are outside that communications world, but as I read, I saw that he was not an obscure figure inside. Why him? Why did you make him the sort of focus and thread throughout the book?
You're writing I'm not writing an essay for 3 readers. I'm trying to write a book that has a narrative and maybe might appeal to more than 3 readers. And when I came across and you have no idea what your narrative is going to be. You have no idea what your ending is going to be, not to mention your beginning. And so you just interview people, and every time you interview someone, you say to them, who should I be sure to talk to? And as I'm reporting, I'm now in probably my 5th month. I had known Kasson a little bit from, he had represented Microsoft, and I covered the Microsoft trial here in 2000 for the New Yorker, and then a book on that. And I said, can I come and talk to you? So I came and talked to him, and I said, tell me about MediaLink, the company you run. And I find out that his clients include everyone from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New York Post, Rupert Murdoch and 21st Century Fox, Disney, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Unilever, Bank of America. And so at negotiations between the client and the agency and the publishing platform, he represents all 3. So I said, isn't that a conflict of interest? He said, no conflict, no interest. and he's a funny guy. So if you apply it in Washington terms, if you're covering the Johnson administration, you're saying, who's this power broker Bobby Baker? And then you go on to Clark Clifford and others. He is that in the advertising world. Part of the enticement for me is that the public didn't know him. And so it was like sharing this discovery of someone in the ad world knows, but outside doesn't.
Okay, so there are so many different components of this book that you weave together. One part of it is that, a core of it, of course, is that the advent of digital communications has transformed so many things. But you have a section early on about fraud in the digital world and about how trying to track these advertisements ends up being very tricky because so much of it is fraudulent. Talk a little bit about what the consequences are of this and what the remedies are without getting into Russian fraud, which we'll talk about later.
Remedies is a harder to come up with an answer for that. But what happens is that the Facebooks and Googles of this world, or the digital people who are collecting all this big data, as they call it, they think of themselves as scientists. And we're going to make this a science. And you're going to know when someone watches an ad, we'll be able to tell you, unlike people who watch a Super Bowl ad, who saw the ad. Did they watch the entire ad or click off at some point? And did they purchase something because of the ad? And isn't that wonderful? And it is, if you can do that, pushing aside the privacy questions for a second. But what happens is the scientists came up, and this is particularly true of Facebook, they would say if someone watched a video, digital video, for a second, it counts as a full view. And so the advertisers, when they discovered that Facebook was claiming a 1-second viewing is equivalent of a 30-second viewing, they said, wait a second, what are you doing? And this is not fair. And Facebook was forced, within a period of 3 months, to admit 8 different times that their measurement system was faulty. And advertisers pulled back and they said, this is really troublesome to us. We're spending money. It's bad enough that we spend $5 million on a 30-second Super Bowl ad and we don't know who watched it, but we know it's a big audience potentially. But you, who's supposed to be able to certify viewership and what happens, are tricking us. It's fraud. And so Facebook has been kind of scrambling to catch up and deal with that. But it's a real problem. And they are not as scientific as they like to say they are.
So I'd like to, we'll talk about the ad world a little bit more directly, but I'd like to dig into Facebook, Google, and even Amazon a little bit. I was struck towards the end of the book, Michael Kasson noted that 62% of Americans get their news from Facebook. There is an enormous amount of reach and power in Facebook. Add in Google, and you have an even deeper penetration. And now Amazon increasing its own footprint. Talk a little bit about them and their respective footprints, and we'll get to the scandals, but it's also worth noting, just as we start this part of the conversation, that we now have an additional layer of scandals as we're finding out that privacy has been breached multiple times and they've lied about it. And we just saw, I think yesterday, that an additional number in multi-millions inadvertently on Facebook had information that was supposed to be private put in the public network. And I saw somebody tweeting, isn't it odd that it's always that the private information becomes public. It's never that they make an error that the public information goes private.
To go back to the point I was started with before about the science and the data scientist and the engineer, who are the people who dominate at Google or Facebook and at Amazon, are people who believe that data is virtuous, because what data does is unlock the secrets of consumer behavior, allows them to disintermediate the superfluous middleman, as they call it, and reduce costs because of that, but also better target at people. So wouldn't an ad, they say, be so much better if we knew enough about George to be able to say, George, you're 2 blocks away. We have your GPS, your location. We can locate you. You're 2 blocks away from a store, let's say Barney's. You don't have one here, do you? Okay, but no. Go with me, George. We're going to get you a new sport coat. And you bought a sport coat last month, and if you walk into Barney's now, you get 20% off another sport coat. Now, you might that's like a really super coupon, right? And so their assumption is that they will be able to entice viewers by targeting with the service, not just an ad. So it's not an annoyance on your personal device, which is a cell phone, which is as personal to you as your purse or your wallet, and you don't never lend it to anyone. But that's their bet. But then at some point, George says, wait a second, how do you know so much about me? And that's where the privacy issue kicks in. If you look at the three companies you mentioned, Google has data on what you've searched, what you're interested in. Facebook has data on who your friends are and what you're talking about. Amazon has the best data because they have data on what you actually purchased. And that's what the advertiser covets. They want that data. And what is Amazon now doing? Amazon is aggressively, for the first time, moving into selling advertising. And it's growing exponentially. The advertisers like this because it gives them leverage over Google and Facebook in the short run. In the long run, they may not like it so much. Certainly the American people may not like it so much in terms of the privacy issue. But one of the things that's happening, Amazon is disrupting Google in a major way because half the people who do a search for a product don't do it on Google anymore, even though Google has 80% market share of search. Half the people who do a search for a product do it on Amazon. So Google is being disrupted. So the great disruptor is being disrupted by Amazon.
So I want to get into the privacy issue a little bit more, but I want to first focus a little bit on the scandals. So when Facebook's top people testified in front of Congress about the Russian ads, then Senator Al Franken, after being told that they had no idea any of this was going on, asked how they couldn't know when ads were being purchased in rubles. And there was no answer for that. And now we're heading into another election campaign that is maybe the most pivotal one in modern history, and the outcome being so extraordinarily important. Do you have any confidence, having dug so deeply into this, that they're better now, that they will be willing to sacrifice possibly some revenue to begin to block some of the bots, some of the ads that are clearly illegal or erroneous?
I have some. I don't have confidence that the semi-literate members, most members of Congress who asked those dumb questions of Mark Zuckerberg when he appeared before the Senate and the House have the ability to regulate. But they have the ability to ask questions, and they have the ability to shame, and I think shame is really important. I covered the Microsoft trial, as I mentioned before, and you watch what happened in that trial. Microsoft lost. The Judge Jackson ruled at first that they should be broken up, which is what the Justice Department wanted, which I always thought was a cockamamie idea because the market, I mean, the internet was going to break them up. Open source software, it was going to break up, which it did, and took away their monopoly power. But Microsoft for the next 10 years was defensive, reticent, hesitant, they moved differently. They were ashamed, they were embarrassed. And I think that's inevitably going to happen, and is probably happening now to Sheryl Sandberg and Mark Zuckerberg and Barrett. They're human beings. They have kids. They're not the machines that we want to portray them as, nor are the engineers. One of the reasons that a lot of engineers, I did a book on Google, and one of the reasons why they recruited engineers and they recruited so many talented people, because they thought, don't be evil. They believed that slogan, and they thought this was a way to change the world. So it was idealistic. Now what happened is that the idealism curdled and turned to something else, and it turned, particularly as they got into advertising. And so the customer became the advertiser, not the user of Facebook or Google, and that's a real problem. You mentioned the impact on media. 2 years ago, the Times did a study. They said we have, or maybe it was 3 years ago now, we have to get into the digital world because they discovered in this 92-page study that half the people who were reading an article on the New York Times, digital, online, had come not through the New York Times website, but through Facebook. And that's profound. It means that there's no brand value in the New York Times. People don't even necessarily know who wrote the article or what institution it's from. And that's profound. But one of the things that's bubbling up now, and I don't know whether it will take effect, but potentially it could. You see Robert Thompson, who's the head of the News Corp, who's who works, which Murdoch newspapers, and Murdoch, but others as well, chiming in, saying, why shouldn't Facebook and Google, who are popularizing our content, why shouldn't they compensate us the way the cable companies compensate the networks or the cable channels for running, the programs? I mean, under the Cable Act of 1992, the cable companies that say if you have your cable and you can get CBS or NBC, you have to pay them, and you have to pay the local station for their news, et cetera. Retransmission consent, the fee that the cable companies now pay broadcasters, is billions of dollars a year. Last year, it's $1 billion just for CBS.
Yeah.
So they're saying, why can't we have retransmission consent paid by the Googles and Facebooks? If that came to be, and that's something that Congress could do as they did the Cable Act, that would be a profound change. It would also mean that Google and Facebook would not have the kind of 40% profit margins they now enjoy.
So just a little bit to follow up on that topic, you just briefly mentioned net neutrality, but as you were saying that you didn't need to break up Microsoft because the open internet would make those changes. We're now on the verge of losing net neutrality, which the proponents of net neutrality say will give even more clout to these giants. What do you think?
Well, there's always been a traditional argument, who is more powerful, content providers or distributors? And one of the, and that's gone on for years, and there's still people who believe that content's more important and others who believe that the pipe or the distribution. If you think about high-speed internet and you think about the world moving towards streaming television, that's dependent upon having a thick pipe or broadband access to the home. And that would argue that the distributor really is more important because there aren't that many who have that ability. You have the telephone companies, you have the cable companies that have that. And soon we're going to have 5G, which is you're going to have wireless. You'll be able to download a movie in a couple of seconds on your cell phone. And that opens up new possibilities. However, if you look at AT&T, which bought DirecTV, they not only have 100 some odd million digital subscribers on their cell phones and the data from all of that, they now have a content company or distribution of content in DirecTV, and now they're vying to buy Time Warner, which is a content company. If you combine the content company and the distribution company, it really answers the question by saying both are vital, content and distribution. And that's why Verizon's talked about maybe buying CBS, and they're all talking about how do we, it's why Facebook is going to do movies, as Google has YouTube, and Amazon has Prime, but they're all racing into a world where they combine content and distribution. But the advantage goes to those with a high-speed internet pipe.
So that's going to transform things if we're in a serious way.
I think
So I want to come back to the privacy issue. And we know that Europe has handled this in a very different way than we have. But just looking at the inexorability of what's happening and the fact that so many Americans have been unconcerned about losing privacy because the trade-off seems fine for them. If you talk to the millennial generation or younger generations, they haven't grown up in an era where anything about them was private. Is privacy gone? Is there any way to create some boundaries?
Well, you look at the boundary that Western Europe, 28 nations of Western Europe as of May 25th, have a new policy. And the policy says that you have cookies on your phone or your computer, your laptop, your iPad, and those cookies are your data, what you've done. It's your fingerprints. It's like a wiretap of what you do. And right now in the U.S., if you don't want people to have access to your data or your cookies, you have to opt out. And you can opt out. Each of us can opt out of people collecting our cookies. There are negatives to that. For instance, if you go I mean, I happen to like when I go on, if I buy a book on Amazon, I like that they say, Ken, people who've bought this book have also bought it. It gives me, it's like browsing in a bookstore a little bit. And I like that, but if you don't have, they don't have access to your cookies, you can't do things like that. Google can't anticipate your searches the way, because they know your behavior. However, if you want to opt out, it is such a cumbersome, complicated procedure to do, so people don't opt out. What they've done in Western Europe is say you have to opt in. The advertising community and the publishers and all the 4As and ANAs, the advertising organizations, hate this because they see it as a real threat to their business. Because they say many people will not choose to opt in, and therefore we will not have access to their cookies. We will not have access to information. We can't target ads to these people anymore. So they've united, the Googles and Facebooks and the advertising community, people who are frenemies have united in fighting it here. But if you listen to the questions that were asked of Mark Zuckerberg, you have a sense that the issue of privacy has been elevated some in the US, and the more you learn about how much information they really have about all of us, it may be elevated more. I remember talking to Evan Spiegel, who was the guy who created Snapchat, when I interviewed him in 2015. His argument then, and he was not collecting a lot of data then, his argument to me was that Snapchat is going to beat Facebook because Generation Z, which is the generation below the millennials, basically teenagers, they care more about privacy than millennials do. Yeah. And we're going to protect their privacy. And he did that until he realized that he didn't have an advertising business, so he now collects more data and talks less about privacy than he did then.
So I would actually, something that struck me last night and again today, we now have a Justice Department that's completely reversed itself on the constitutionality of the core of the Affordable Care Act. That includes limitations on using pre-existing conditions. And I began to think, when health insurance companies, if that goes away, begin to tap into the data, and we're seeing many of these companies buy health insurers as well, and you look at whether somebody searched for prostate cancer or melanoma, and it may be a friend asked them to search, but that information could be used to take away insurance or to double or triple premiums. And that's a twist on privacy, along with all of the information, the genetic information, much of which has been now stolen from people who got genetic testing. Privacy gets taken to a different level than whether you're buying certain things or searching for certain products.
Well, just as it did, you remember all of us who are parents, the worry we had about our kids on Facebook. Mm-hmm. And are they writing things that will be preserved and prevent them, when they're out of college, from getting a job because they said these dumb things? And it's related to that issue. Absolutely, it's a huge issue, potentially, which is another reason why you have to say, watch the privacy issue. It is a potential issue that will bubble up and bite these people in the rear end. And that's probably a healthy thing.
So you write interesting things about Amazon and Alexa, and the guy who created Siri, who started that, who now has a completely new generation, a product that's now been purchased by Samsung. And we're starting to see some things about how Alexa can actually listen into every conversation you're having. I saw something the other day that they've now got a robot, and Alexa can say, shoot the gun, and the robot shoots a gun, which may replace the teachers in the classrooms. But talk just a little bit about the advent of these instruments. And I actually have decided I'm not going to buy one of these machines that enables me to tell Alexa to turn on the lights or turn off the music for just that reason. What are the pros and the cons of this new technology?
Alexa is artificial intelligence or digital assistants, which is what Alexa is, or Siri was, or Google Home, and they're all racing to do this. And the idea is that we will make your life easier by anticipating your needs, making appointments for you, listening in. So, you know, I mean, if you have an Alexa, I do, at home, I don't use it very much, but Alexa, play Paul Simon, Sounds of Silence. Within 2 seconds, it comes on. So that's kind of a nice service. I like that. On the other hand, I'll sometimes say, Alexa, not meaning to talk to, and Alexa says, yes. You know, I don't want to get out of my life. You know,
Yeah.
and so these are devices that are based on artificial intelligence, which all these companies are pouring enormous resources in. And the desire is to basically anticipate your needs and to service your needs, including your imagined needs, what they imagine you might want. And do you want that in your house? And do you want them to know that much about you? Alexa knows what time you wake up, what you read, how much time you spend on your computer. I mean, it is basically, it's tapping you. It's wiretapping you. And it provides many useful services to you. And on the other hand, is it something that we should be concerned about? I think so. Yeah, I do.
So you also have, and I want to explore artificial intelligence a little bit more, a fascinating tidbit about using weather as a beachhead to figure out people's preferences. And IBM now getting into this, that people behave in a certain way when it's cold or when it's raining, and
IBM
that taps into advertising.
IBM bought weather.com, and one of the reasons they bought it is because they're aggressively getting into the advertising business. IBM and Deloitte and McKinsey and these consulting companies that used to represent the ad agencies, either providing their computers or consulting with them or doing their accounting work, have said, God, we have relationships in the C-suite with the CFOs and the CEOs. Why can't we be in this rich advertising world? It's a new revenue stream for us. So we're going to jump into it. IBM, which is essentially a service company, much less than it's a computer company today, bought weather.com because they said, this is one of the most valuable tools we would have to figure out behavior. And for instance, they say when it's cold out, and it's going to be cold tomorrow, it's a great incentive for Campbell Soup to sell hot soup. And in fact, Campbell advertised with them. On movie theaters, they advertise more on movies when they know it's going to be a terrible day out or a rainy day out. So the argument they make, and they believe it, and they have some evidence that there's truth to it, is that weather determines behavior. And if weather determines behavior, it determines purchasing. And therefore, we're going to sell that to clients, and that's what they do. And so far, they've been reasonably successful. And they're pouring huge amounts of money into IBM is, into artificial intelligence, thinking that is a vehicle to help them do that even better.
So they're getting into advertising. And you have one of your major players who said that we have gone from Mad Men to media men to math men, and that the ad agencies now are not ad agencies anymore, they're consulting and tech companies. So reflect a little bit on those changes.
Well, it's the reason I call the book Frenemies is because if you think about an ad agency, traditionally the ad agency, their major client was the publishers who be they the TV publisher or the newspaper publisher or magazine, and they sold them ads, right? In other words, the publishers sold ads they said to the advertiser, we want you to spend your money on ads on the New York Times platform or NBC platform. And great. And what happened? You go to the New York Times today, they have a staff in the sales department of 300 people. 100 of those people are creating ads. The New York Times is an ad agency. So is NBC, so is BuzzFeed, so are most publishing platforms. So they're not just your friend, they're your enemy too, they're your competitor. PR agencies increasingly saying newspapers are shrinking, magazines, we got to get another revenue stream. They become ad agencies, particularly skilled at doing things in social media. And the clients increasingly saying, hey, wait a second, why am I spending all this money? Let's take some of this stuff in-house. So the client who you depend on, Procter & Gamble, becomes a frenemy. Google and Facebook, whose data you want and who you spend enormous amounts of your advertising dollars on, they increasingly disintermediate the ad agency and go directly to the client. They become a frenemy as well. So you say, oh my God, the ad agencies are surrounded by frenemies, but the biggest frenemy is the public, because the public is saying, this device, which is what most people rely on today. They don't rely on their desktop or their portable. They rely on this. And an ad on this is an interruption. And it really actually makes you angry, particularly those terrible ads, the pre-rolls and the banner ads and the video ads that soak up your battery life. And you got to wait till the X, and you can't cross the X out, and it's still on your screen, and you're going crazy. And it's really very annoying. And so 20% of Americans who have a cell phone put an ad blocker on it, meaning they block ads. So what the newspapers are doing, and a lot of media companies are doing, is creating what they call native ads, which is really a way of tricking you into thinking you're seeing journalism, you're seeing a story, but it's really a story written by the in-house agency and with very minimal disclosure that it's an ad, not a story, because it looks just like a story. They're trying to get around that problem. And so that's the existential crisis for all of advertising. And if all of advertising has an existential crisis, since it's the funding mechanism for all media, we all have an existential crisis. We rely on advertising. So people then come back and say, well, the answer is let's go to a subscription model. Let's replace advertising with subscriptions. I argue that's a pipe dream, and here's why. The one thing that Clinton and Trump agreed on in 2016 is that the working class, the American middle class, the bulk of the American population, their income was frozen for the last decade. They already spend $260 a month on average for subscriptions, and that does not include gas and electricity. How are these people who are strapped going to be able to compensate and pay for Facebook and Google searches and CBS and NBC, which is free essentially now? Now, a lot of companies, the successful companies, CBS, for instance, they're one of the characters in my book, Les Moonves is, because I'm trying to say, can an old legacy media company become new? CBS, when I did a book on the television networks in '91, before the retransmission consent and other changes that the government imposed, which allowed them to get more income, CBS got 100% of its revenues, as did NBC and ABC and Fox, from advertising. Today, CBS gets 46%, half. They've cut in half the amount of reliance on advertising. Why? Because they have retransmission consent gave them, as I said before, $1 billion. The government in '94 passed, they removed the FinCEN rules, which prevented networks from owning programs. Now they're allowed to own programs and sell them. So if you look at the schedule on the networks, almost every program is owned all or in part by the network that puts it on, and they could sell it. So that's over $1 billion of revenue. Then you have the growth of Netflix and Amazon and Apple and YouTube, and they sell programs to them. So CBS last year and Fox last year made $250 million just from Netflix alone. That goes right to your bottom line, because these are programs already made. You're selling your library of stuff. On the other hand, when you're selling to a frenemy, you're selling to your competitor. So what does that mean? In the short run, you're getting nice revenue. In the long run, you're building up Netflix. And that's part of the world we're living in. And again, it's why I thought the title Frenemies covered a broad span.
So I want to explore this part of it a little bit more, because clearly we're talking about these dramatic changes in the world, and some are going to be dinosaurs, some of these entities. They are going to disappear with a new ice age for them. And I'd like to explore a couple of these areas a little bit more. One is the newspapers. You've talked about the Times a little bit. The Times and the Post have had a resurgence of sorts. The Post at least says it's making money now, that they've managed at least to find in some fashion, a digital edition that is bringing in some revenue stream. The Times is doing its own advertising, but they're also branching out in other areas. I mean, I noticed, I think it was in this past Sunday's paper, that they're now competing with Blue Apron. You can get New York Times meals, and they're using the name to try and expand into other areas. We know what's happened with newspapers below the elite level. They're being basically drained by hedge fund companies, but there doesn't seem to be any revenue model that could work for them. And we also know that there's a Trump bump for the Times and the Post. And if and when he goes away, will that bring them back to struggling again? Is there any future for newspapers, even for the elite ones like the Journal, the Times, and the Post?
The Times and the Post and the Journal and the New Yorker and the Economist and the FT have something that the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Detroit News, New Orleans Picayune Times doesn't have. And that they have a user base that's fairly affluent, and they could increase the charge, the subscription charge to them. And they've done it. The New York Times, which used to be reliant, 80% of the revenues used to come from advertising. Today, just under 50% comes from advertising because they've raised subscriptions. The New Yorker, the same thing. And that's great. The other newspapers can't do that. But even if you look closely at the Times, the Washington Post is a different model. They found a friendly billionaire who has a Kindle, and the Kindle, puts that on. And he's conversant with the digital world, and they've done very creative things to their credit, and to Jeff Bezos' credit. Yeah. The Washington Post is a better newspaper today. And Donnie Graham, when he sold it, said, I can't take this paper to the next step. And Bezos could, and he has. And he's drawn the ire of Donald Trump to his credit. The Times, and I have this in the book, illustrates the problem of the digital world. The average reader of the New York Times newspaper spends 34 minutes a day reading the print newspaper. The average reader of the New York Times, as of a couple of years ago, and I don't, the figures I'm told are not, but I was told by Mark Thompson, the CEO, they're comparable today, that the average reader of the New York Times digital newspaper spends 35 minutes, not a day, a month on the paper. So if you're an advertiser, you say, therefore, the reader is not spending much time looking at my ads, which is why the average ad in the digital paper costs 1/10 what that same ad in the print paper costs. And that's the problem. Where does the Times make its profit today? From the print newspaper. The print newspaper, ideally, it's 60% of the cost. The paper, the distribution, et cetera. So you'd love to get rid of that if you can. It's very hard to do that when that's the source of your profit. And it's hard to do that when people are not spending enough time on your digital newspaper to create a profit. So the Times is profitable, marginally profitable. It's the best, in my judgment, the best newspaper in the world. And they've had a bump, but they're still doing great stuff without the great stuff they do on Donald Trump. But they are totally reliant on one source of revenue, one business, the New York Times. They don't own TV stations, radio stations, others. So they're desperate to get into figure out other revenue streams, conferences they do. There's very little money. Everyone's doing that. They don't make that money. If you had to do over again, you'd say, why didn't the Times become Google? Why weren't they the search engine? And if you look at Sports Illustrated, you say, why wasn't Sports Illustrated ESPN before that? And if you go back with the benefit of hindsight, you can say, the Times has all this great information. They could have been a great search engine. but they weren't, and they're not, and they're challenged. And I do think that even if the Sulzberger family at some point says, we can't give enough dividends to all the Sulzbergers who really care about that paper much more than the Bancrofts did at the Wall Street Journal and some other families did. If at some point the family feels they have to sell, or like Donald Graham, we have to take the Times to the next level we need, there will be some billionaire. Michael Bloomberg has always wanted to buy the New York Times, but he's 77 years old or 76 years old, and time's running out on that. But there will be a Bezos for a prestige publication like that.
So let's move to broadcasters. And you have a substantial focus on Leslie Moonves, who's a friend of many of us in this room, actually, and who's an extraordinary guy. And I want to ask you not just about what he's done with CBS and his confidence that he can keep this going in the face of serious headwinds, but whether you have any insights now into the DEFCON 1 battle with Sherry Redstone, with a company, Viacom, that has flagged, even as CBS has surged, and what might happen.
Well, I have a letter in the book that was written by Marty Lipton, who's Les Moonves' attorney and a very prominent attorney representing businesses in New York and elsewhere around the country. And in the letter, there are 9 points, and it's to Sherry Redstone's lawyer, and it says, in order for Mr. Moonves to be willing to combine CBS with Viacom, which, as you said, Norm, was faltering, Mr. Moonves wants the following. He wants you to cede your voting control. She owns roughly 15% or 20%, yet she has 80% voting control. And 2 classes of stock is common. I mean, Warren Buffett has that, Murdoch has that, New York Times has it. A lot of companies, Google and Facebook have it. And it actually, in many ways, serves the public interest because it allows people to look at the longer term, not the short-term stock price. But he's saying, we want you to give up your control of that. The board has to be picked by Leslie Moonves. Third, Leslie Moonves can only be removed if his directors on the board want him to be removed. And you're not on the board. I mean, it was an amazing letter. And actually, it is a letter that basically predicted exactly where they are today, where they're at war, Moonves. And Les Moonves is acting as if he doesn't have a boss, that he's the boss. There's probably not a more successful television executive of modern times than Les Moonves. There's no question about that. I mean, CBS been #1 in prime time like 13 of the last 15 years. And he has a team that's been intact, et cetera. But he doesn't own it. And he's acting as if he owns CBS. And she is insanely upset about this. What's he doing? Why is he screaming at me? He's my employee. And he doesn't act like the employee, and he doesn't feel like the employee. So she wants him to combine the companies. He really doesn't want to do that, but he's willing to do that. Then they don't agree about the price that CBS would pay for Viacom because it's a declining business. And the third thing is that she then wants the person she put in charge of Viacom, Bob Bakish, the CEO of Viacom, to be #2 and therefore successor to Les Moonves, who's 68 going on 69. And he doesn't want that. He wants his own person that's been with him to be the COO. So they tried to work it out, couldn't, and now it's a screaming match. And Moonves has proposed to basically to defang her, to take away her voting control, and has gone before the Delaware court asking them to rule that her ownership, voting control, should not exist, and we should be able, the board, to vote it out. And the judge is going to rule on that. My suspicion, I mean, if she wins, he's gone. It's very hard to imagine him winning. Personally, I could be wrong, because if the judge rules in his favor, that opens up Murdoch, Buffett, Google, all the other 2 classes stock companies, and that's a pretty sweeping ruling for basically a local judge in Delaware to make. So I mean, I don't think any good end will come.
Yeah. It's actually so Shakespearean because her father, who wanted her to have nothing to do with the company, who appears to be non compos mentis.
At 94, right?
Yeah, at 94, and she said that he rewrote the will a number of times. It's almost like Donald Trump and his father's will,
But you
that's
know,
another
it's
story.
interesting because the truth is that Moonves sees her the way a lot of people saw her father.
Yeah.
Arbitrary, abrupt,
Yeah.
not focused, I mean, constantly changing the subject. And their meetings, I've been told, are just almost hysterical except for them. They sit there and they're screaming at each other.
So one last question before we open it up. I just want to mention a number of names, and I would like you to simply reflect on how significant they are in the world, not now, but in the future. One is Michael Kasson. Second is Mark Zuckerberg. A third is Leslie Moonves. A fourth is Martin Sorrell. We haven't really talked about these huge companies like WPP that have their tentacles and everything. And the last is Jeff Bezos.
Michael Kasson is a charming character, and I thought he was a delicious character for the book and would help a narrative drive. Of course, his hands are in everything, and he's got a sense of humor, and he's a popular figure. He's also a figure that a lot of people like Martin Sorrell really don't like, because a lot of people in the agency business don't like someone getting between them and their client, and Michael Kasson gets between them and their client. The Martin Sorrell, not in any order. Martin Sorrell started the largest WPP, which is now the largest holding company. There are 5 or 6 of them. Publicis, Omnicom, IPG, but he started one that is the most successful, the first financially successful holding company. And what he did was he branched out from not just from buying, which he did, hostile takeovers of Gray Advertising and Young and Rubicam and Ogilvy and Mather, but also then said, because marketing is growing so fast, the non-advertising side of the business, that I'm going to buy PR agencies, I'm going to buy lobbying firms, I'm going to buy branding companies, I'm going to buy design companies, I'm going to buy direct mail companies, I'm going to buy Kantar, data companies. And so he was very successful. And when I asked him in the last chapter of the book, I said, Mr. Sorrell, I said, you're going to be 73. When do you expect to step down? He said, and I quote, "They'll have to shoot me to get me out of here." Well, 2 months ago they shot him, and he was gone. It was too late for me to add to the main book here, but it's in the ebook version, and obviously in subsequent versions I'll have. But we don't know why he was fired, and the only thing we know is that the board said he spent some non-material amount of money on what in effect a personal. But we don't know what that personal was. And we don't know what non-material is in a $21 billion company. Is it $5 or $5 million or $500 million? And we don't know that and when I asked him after, because I'm trying to update the book, and he said, and he is a major character, he said, I signed a non-disclosure agreement, as did the board, and I can't talk about it. Jeff Bezos. Bezos is I mean, he is insatiable, and he's brilliant. I think he's the new Steve Jobs. I mean, I think he thinks outside the box, and now he's getting into advertising. He sees a real potential there, and he's right. And boy, I mean, you think about, if you go to Amazon and you tell Alexa, batteries, I want to buy batteries. Alexa will come back, and what are they, first thing they'll tell you? Amazon batteries. And Google, because they do that in search, they favor their own product. Google was just paid a fine of $2.4 billion in Europe for exactly that. And that's a real problem with these companies as they get into the content business, that they'll favor their own content.
And Zuckerberg, finally.
Zuckerberg is, when I profiled Sheryl Sandberg, when she left, I knew her at Google when I was doing a Google book, and she left in 2008, and she told me why she was leaving. And then some years later, I wrote a New Yorker profile of it. But she said, Mark Zuckerberg, if you look at what he studied at Harvard before he dropped out, he studied psychology. And he's much more sensitive to human beings than the Google guys were, who were, when you talk to Larry Page in particular at Google, he doesn't look at you, he looks at the floor, which is very common in the Valley. But Zuckerberg actually does look you in the eye. But when I think of the answers he gave to the Senate and the House committee, when he said to them, when they asked him a question, he said, I'll get back to you. I have to check on that. I mean, that's just a blatant lie. I mean, and they were stupid enough not to know that he was not telling the truth, and they should have insisted he give the answer, because he knows everything. He's really a brilliant guy. But he has some appealing qualities, but he doesn't believe in privacy. I mean, if you go back and look at his early statements when he formed Facebook, it was that we're going to connect all the world's information, and people want to share everything. Well, George doesn't want to share his buying history, nor does Jerry Rapshoon. And who else?
Does.
Who else do we have?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned Movies, and I would just ask, because you've talked about him a fair amount, if he's no longer at CBS, what does he do?
Count his money, at least that.
Yeah. That'll take a long time.
Well, if he gets ousted by her, and he has the right to make a claim under his contract to get roughly $180 million. So,
not bad. All right, we'll take some questions now, and I'll start here with these two gentlemen. I hope some students back there will also ask some questions. And
Thank you.
the ground rules, of course, you identify yourself, and it is a question, not a statement.
Yeah, Jack Goldstone, George Mason University. 2 quick questions. What about security? Are we living in a world where our bank account says everything else is open? You saw the Russians able to infiltrate routers in your home and so on. So security and truth. What is the watchguard for truth, especially in political advertising, so that outright falsehoods are somehow kept out of this very powerful algorithm-driven model?
You raise or you identify 2 huge issues. I don't begin to have an answer for either one. Except that these are 2 issues we ought to be talking about a lot, and we're not, and it's worrisome.
And right here, and then this young man.
My name is John Klein. I wondered what you thought will be or should be, maybe both questions, the outcome of the AT&T Time Warner case.
I suspect that the outcome will be that AT&T will win the case and not be deemed a monopoly. Having covered the Microsoft trial, if just to go back to that, that was the first trial where emails were used the way a wiretap would be used. And so David Boies was the $1 a year prosecuting attorney for the Justice Department. And the Microsoft guy on the stand would be asked by Boies, did you ever threaten Dell Computer that you would cut them off from Microsoft Word and Microsoft Outlook, et cetera, if they did business with Netscape, which was something that it was the browser that scared the hell out of Microsoft. And so the Microsoft executive said, no, I never would threaten anyone. And Boies, who has a photographic memory, would in the court say, would you call up document 1113? And 1113 would, and it was a text of the email that this Microsoft executive said, I will break your back if you don't drop. And it was just devastating. And when I interviewed the judge, I spent a lot of hours interviewing the judge at the end, and the judge says, I didn't believe these people, they just lied. And he ruled very forcefully against them. So I don't see that in the AT&T. And I mean, if Comcast tried to buy, which they're going to try to do, 21st Century Fox, and if they wanted to buy the network, the government would say, you have NBC, you can't have Fox Network as well. Disney doesn't buy the Fox Network in that, so there's no conflict. And so my suspicion is that the judge will rule in favor of AT&T. He may impose some restrictions on them, as they did when Comcast bought Universal. They said there was a lot of concern. Bloomberg had concern. CNN had concern. Where are you going to put my channel? Are you going to unfavor my channel by putting in the 200s when you're going to put MSNBC and CNBC up higher? So that maybe they'll have restrictions like that. But my guess, I could be wrong. That would be my guess.
And right up here, Gary.
Thank you, Gary Arlen from Arlen Communications. You've talked about frenemies and you've talked about implicitly joint ventures that are vertically integrated. Talk a little bit about how Apple, which has never been really it's a software company, but not an entertainment company. It distributes other entertainment. How do hardware companies play in this?
I don't see Apple just a hardware company. I do see it as a software company too.
Content?
Yeah, no, but I think also they are iTunes content. Apple, now they've announced they're going to spend $1 billion on television programming and movies. So they all realize that you can't just be a dumb pipe. You need content, and then the question will be, do they need advertising? And Apple is actually taking this. Apple and Microsoft have taken the same position, and it's a position aimed at Google and Facebook. We are going to protect your privacy. We're not going to gather data, and it's immoral. Tim Cook has said, the CEO of Apple, for them to be collecting this information. That is a positioning statement based on the fact that they are giants at war, and they're trying to get an advantage. But I think they're all jumping in the content business. Facebook is jumping in the video business, and probably movies at some point. They're not in the hardware business, and Apple is really good at it, and they're able to pull something else off, which is to treat Apple as a luxury item that they charge exorbitant amounts of money for, and get away with it so far.
But do you think that the ability to innovate, to create some dramatic new product, seems to be slowing, and the sales are lagging a little bit for some of those products? Was that a major impetus for them to branch out more into the content field?
Sure, no question.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, right here.
Thanks. You two both share the same problem that you write.
Identify yourself.
Don Wilson, Leader Strategies. Yeah. You both share the same problem that you write faster than most of us can read. But so trying to keep up with both of your books is quite a task. I have a question for both of you, actually. The level of cyber invasion critique that has occurred about 2016 and since, if you could awaken the public about what you both think occurred and what the main dangers are, and how successful was this? Are we talking voting machines, media only, Facebook intrusion, and the like? How do you two see this?
Okay, I'll start. I'm deeply alarmed in a few ways. One is I think there is little doubt that the Russians did hack into voter registration systems in some states as a trial. And the fact is, if you have some help, and I am very confident they had help from highly sophisticated Americans pinpointing states, congressional districts, precincts, and you get into voter registration systems, which are pretty easily hackable, and you change a few thousand middle initials or one digit in the last four of the Social Security number, people go to the polls and they're told they're not registered. We had almost a couple 100,000 who faced this problem in Los Angeles County, and we still don't know whether that was a human error or something else. And they were told, vote, you can cast a provisional ballot. A lot of them just went home. I've talked to Oracle and other companies because the federal government's doing nothing about this, and the states don't have the money. And I've asked them to create a coalition, they're a database company, to help to provide some protections. Now, I'd make one other comment. Imagine that it's recruiting season, as it has been at Stanford, and these incredibly bright electrical engineers, computer scientists are coming out, and there are the booths for Facebook and Google and Amazon, and there is the NSA and the other intelligence agencies. And when they go to Google and Facebook and Amazon, these people are given these incredible, staggering deals, large amounts of money, the bus that'll take you, all the free food and the other things, and then they go to the NSA. We can promise you a 5-year pay freeze. Maybe it'll be 7 years. And you're going to be trashed by the president who thinks that intelligence agencies are wrong. And we can't guarantee you a job right now anyhow. You'll have to wait a few months, and then you'll have to pay your way to Washington. And it's not just Russia, it's China, it's terrorist groups, it's many others who are using their best and brightest to infiltrate not just the voting area, but all other areas of our life, and the banking system, and the health system, and whatever. And we've already been hacked multiple times. This scares me to death. And I think we're not seeing many of our policymakers who are focused on this at all. And it's partly because they know nothing about technology. It's partly because we have so many scandals, it's hard to breathe anymore. But if we aren't worried about this, we're in big trouble. And by the way, Oracle so far has not responded to me.
Ditto. No, I think it's a pretty eloquent answer that Noam's just given. I would.
Thanks very much, Ken. I'm Garrett Mitchell. I want to ask a kind of retro question, and that is, how did it come to be in 2015 and 2016 that Donald Trump was able to pull something off that no other political candidate has ever been able to pull off, which is to say that he could be on his choice of Good Morning America Today, et cetera, but not be on the set? Where was the, how did that happen? Is that just a Trump thing? What?
It's the commercial interests of the networks to give him that kind of attention and not to give attention to the Republican opponents of him. He got, and there were some, I have the figures in the book, the amount, billions of dollars worth of free publicity. He did very little advertising. He didn't have to do advertising. He was getting free media, which most candidates failed to get in a campaign. He was a reality TV star. He was a celebrity, and he was colorful and outrageous. He would say, you don't know what he's going to say. Talk about someone's hands, talk about his penis. He's just, oh my God, it's like live TV. We got to watch this. And the press, to their discredit, in my judgment, gave him way too much attention. And they give too much attention to him now. I mean, I am actually, I really, when I'm writing, and I go in and let's say my wife and I were staying home, and I do a lot of cooking in the house. So I'm propelled at 4 o'clock to turn on Jake Tapper at CNN to find out what the lunatic has done today, right? And I turn on the entire hour, and then Wolf Blitzer, breaking news. It's all about Trump. The next hour and a half, it's all about Trump. And I'm saying, there's nothing here about the Middle East. There's nothing here about Korea. I mean, it's wall-to-wall Trump, and it's too much. And he now is bridling about that. But he says accurately, I'm good for your business, guys. And he is. And it shows. And it's actually, as a journalist and as a media critic, it depresses me.
Would you be willing to tell your Trump story to this larger group?
Oh, yeah, sure.
This is a wonderful story.
I know Trump some from New York, and in the two parts of the story. In 1978, I was doing a profile of Roy Cohn, who was easily the most disgusting human being I've ever met in my life. And
he's met a lot of people.
Yeah, we're really disgusting. And you would go, he would go to the 21 Club, which was like a club of his. And at first he said he wouldn't cooperate, and I said, all right, I'll do the piece anyway. I told his law partner. Within 20 minutes he called, and we were off to the races. So I spent a lot of time with him. And you go to 21 Club with him, he wouldn't order. You would sit there, and suddenly this lizard-like hand would be taking, with his fingers, be taking food off your plate. I couldn't believe it. And he'd sit there, and he would tell you, Bess Myers, and I did her divorce. Let me tell you about her and what she did. And he's just trading in his clients just for gossip. But Roy Cohn made the following position very clear throughout the time I spent with him. You never apologize. delay paying your bills. Hyperbole and exaggeration is good. Always attack, never be on the defense. I interviewed Donald Trump back then for this piece. He says, Roy is my mentor. And if you think about President Trump, many of those things is his modus operandi. And when he talked about his frustration with his attorney general, he said, he doesn't have my back, unlike Roy Cohn would have my back. And he wouldn't. He would lie for you and steal for you and do all these terrible things for you. So my parents lived in Trump Village in Coney Island. And my father had a little sporting goods store in Coney Island. And he would go around the corner to our favorite restaurant. I was already in college at this time. No, I was actually a Daily News columnist and writing in the New Yorker as well. In Coney Island, the Daily News column is a big deal. You have pictures in the paper. No one reads the New Yorker. They don't know from, it's a foreign nation. It's another planet. And so my father would go around the corner and he would see Fred Trump sitting there at a table. Hi, Fred. Hi, Pat. That's all they knew each other, just waving. They never had a conversation in their life. My father would go sit and have his lunch. And Donald Trump, who was afraid of his father, would come down often to Gargiulo's to have lunch with his father. And his father would say to him, that guy over there, he's the father of the guy who writes the column in the Daily News. And Trump would say, oh, I know him. And so I'm a Knicks fan, basketball fan.
I feel so sorry for you.
I know. Right? Well, listen, you finally had a victory, you people in Washington. But not in basketball.
Yeah.
Though the Knicks are worse, I must say. So I would go to a Knicks game and I'd see Donald there. And I had written about Donald and some of the sweetheart deals he had gotten because of his father, tax breaks him when he bought the Commodore Hotel, roughly $200 million. And you couldn't offend Donald Trump. You'd write these negative pieces, and he would write you a note, unlike today, and say, let's have lunch sometime. And of course, I have a perfect record of never having lunch with him, and just ignoring the letters. But I would see him in a Knicks game, and he would say to me, hey, Kenny. No one calls me Kenny. Hey, Kenny, how's your pop? And I would say, actually, he died. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. The next year at the Knicks game, hey, Kenny, how's your pop? Oh, he died. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Third year, hey, Kenny, how's your pop? And I looked at him, we're roughly the same height. I looked at him and I said, the same. And I walked away.
That is a wonderful story. Question right back there.
Hi. All right, my name is Eric. My name is Eric Clark. I was wondering what you both thought about the Mark Zuckerberg trial and the Facebook controversy, and how it might affect the relationship between advertisement and the right to privacy as we know it today.
I mean, I think that clearly Facebook and will be challenged increasingly on the privacy front, and I think that many of Zuckerberg's lame answers to the Congress will exacerbate that opposition and concern that people have about the data that Facebook collects on them. So I think he did not do himself well. And Facebook, if you think about it, when the first charges came out last fall that fake news, that Facebook was used to disseminate fake news, Zuckerberg said, and I quote, he said, that's a crazy idea. That didn't happen. He was forced some months later to rescind that statement and say, I was wrong. They did do it, and we didn't catch it. So it's one of many apologies that he's had to make, and I just think that will all add to the mix of people agitated about doing something about Facebook and privacy.
So I'd make a couple of comments. One is, Mark Zuckerberg a year or so ago was going all over Iowa and clearly had political aspirations. Sheryl Sandberg, who actually had served in a pretty significant position with Larry Summers in an administration, and who's written these popular books, also has had political aspirations. I think you can forget about both of those right now. Now they're still CEOs. Howard Schultz just left Starbucks.
Mark Cuban.
And Mark Cuban. You would think that after Trump where we've learned that we can run government like a business, but it's Trump University, that we might be moving away from people with no experience in politics or governance. But it's clearly hit Facebook. And I would also say, and I would ask for your comment on this too, Ken. So we have all of this about Facebook, breaches in privacy, news stories every day that, oops, we made another mistake, oops, we did it again. And it doesn't seem to faze the people who are so tied to Facebook. And they keep going back and they keep using it in the same way. Is there any sign that there will be some kind of a public backlash other than that broader defacement of the name Facebook?
I suggested this before, but I'll amplify it some. We're dealing with human beings here. Mark Zuckerberg, we may think of him as a machine, and he has a brain like a machine. He's really smart, and he wants to be a scientist. He's an engineer. But he's a human being. He's got 2 little kids, and he's got a wife who's a teacher, and he gives to education. Pardon? She's a physician. I'm sorry, you're absolutely right.
It gives a lot to education.
Yeah. And so he's someone who has to be chastened by what he's endured here and has to be shamed, just as Bill Gates was shamed in 2000 by the embarrassment he went through. And Microsoft went through, as I said before, 10 years of being defensive and tentative. He will become more tentative because he's going to worry, and his advisors are going to tell him, watch out for the government. And he's going to be attacked more often. And he's a human being. It's going to hurt. So I think it will have an impact where they will have to, even though they don't naturally want to, say, will this exacerbate our problems? Will this allow us the privacy issue to be used against us more forcefully?
So I'm going to ask you one more. Susan. Oh, I'm sorry. Over here first, and then Susan. Yeah, we'll take the mic.
Oh, thank you. Hi, my name is Angela Gordon, and I'm a return student at Trinity University, D.C., at Washington. I beg your pardon. So I am a journalism student, and I love encouraging others. And while I have you 2 greats here, I would like to have video rolling. Would like to set it up as if we're like at a promotional exercise and just ask you for words of encouragement to those students in my field of journalism and in writing to share something for them to keep the journey going.
I mean, journalism is a public service.
Yes.
Your job, in part, is to keep people honest and to provide information that they may not be getting from their officials, and officials could be teachers or principals or city council members, and you're an independent auditor, and that's an important public service. And so I can't think of, I mean, people say, did you ever think about running for office and being a public servant? And I say no, because I think I am a public servant, and I think all journalists are public servants if they do a good job.
Well, I would add, first, the president of Trinity, Pat McGuire, was my student. She is a wonderful human being, and it is a wonderful school, and you're very lucky to be there.
Yes.
Look at who the heroes are now in our society as we go through these enormous stresses. Ronan Farrow, who has emerged as this terrific investigative reporter and has transformed many things in the country. The teams at the Washington Post and the New York Times, but also local and regional newspapers that are uncovering scandals and problems. And it's going to be an enormously stressful thing because many of these institutions are going to go out of business. And I would say it's not just the evil hedge funds. I was in Greensboro, North Carolina, and that newspaper is owned by Berkshire Hathaway. And they've cut their staff dramatically. And they're not doing it for a political purpose, unlike some papers which have cut out cartoonists who do things that they don't like. But this is not going to be an easy field to get into. But it is, if there is anything crucial to the foundation of a free society, it is the free press. And if there is anything more disturbing about Donald Trump than calling the free press the enemy of the people, I don't know what it is. So,
thank you very much.
Yes, last question from Susan Ness here, right in the middle.
Thank you.
Ken and Norm, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much. A quick question. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act provides a safe harbor for platforms so that they're not responsible for user-generated content. And historically, that section has been viewed as having been the engine behind much of the growth and innovation in Silicon Valley with the platforms. With the explosion of hate speech and viral deception, more and more people are talking about that safe harbor as being something that has outlived its usefulness and are beginning to look at platforms as more media companies rather than tech companies. I just wondered whether you had any thoughts on that topic that you could share.
This has been an ongoing debate. Martin Sorrell, for instance, has long argued that the Googles and Facebook are media companies. The New York Times and others make that. And the whole argument for them compensating media companies is predicated on the notion that they are media companies, that they're in the content business. And they resist that, A, because they don't want to be regulated, and B, because they see themselves as tech companies. They honestly do see themselves as tech companies. But they're not. They're media companies. And I think the momentum is increasingly to treat them as tech companies. Actually, this is one area where the Republicans probably would be more willing to be aggressive about the Silicon Valley companies than the Democrats, who are much closer in fundraising, et cetera, to the Googles and the Facebook.
I would just add, this is a real challenge. Twitter has struggled, and there are horrible actors who are issuing death threats and vicious anti-Semitic and racist things, and who remain on the platform, and they've blocked others who seem to be much less offensive. And it's clearly a part of an algorithm. It's also, the algorithms don't work particularly well. You're going to have human beings, and large numbers of them, who are
just on that
doing
point,
this stuff. Yeah.
For instance, Facebook, which had resisted this for cost reasons and because they also said we're not a media company, because of the criticism in this last 6-month period, Facebook has hired 4,000 what they call curators. They're editors, basically, to try and sort out fake news better. They will never 100% sort that out. There's just too much blizzard of information online. But it's costing them money, it's reducing their profit margins, and certifying that they are a media company. So that's going to come back to bite them too.
But you also have to believe that especially with artificial intelligence and with all the resources that Russia and others will put into this, the ability to use bots and to fake accounts and to infiltrate these things is going to grow. And it isn't necessarily the case that the company's ability or any government's ability to leach that out will be moving anywhere near as fast. So I'll end, I'd mentioned the 62% who rely on Facebook for news, but Martin Kasson mentioned two other things. One is that 90% of us are on another device while we're watching television, 90%, and that the attention span of a goldfish is a little bit greater than that of a human being, 8 seconds to 7 seconds. And if that isn't a challenge, not just to advertising, but to human discourse, I'm not sure what is. This book we've only scratched the surface of some of the really interesting things. It's a book where you not only learn a lot, but it really makes you think and ponder where we're going as a society, where we're going as a world, and what will happen to all of us. We're going to have more convenience on the one hand. We are flooded with information. It's another one of the points you make in the book, that it's not that there isn't enough information, it's how you curate the information that is flooding over us, and what all of that means for our freedoms and for our relations with others. There's an awful lot in here that'll make you ponder. So don't just buy this book, but of course buy it. Read this book. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.